Introduction. History is not merely the tale of kings and queens, battles and treaties, victories and defeats. It is, above all, the story of people, ordinary men and women, their struggles, their hopes, their discontent, and their dreams of a better life. Among the great upheavals that shaped the modern world, few rival the French Revolution in its drama, its intensity, and its enduring impact. The French Revolution, which erupted in 1789 and raged for a decade, was no ordinary revolt. It was not just a change of government, nor merely a rebellion against a king. It was a radical reimagining of society, politics, and human rights. It challenged the ancient structures that had governed Europe for centuries and ignited a wave of change that rippled across the world. The rallying cry of liberty, equality, fraternity would become the foundation for modern democracies and inspire generations of revolutionaries. But how did it all begin? Why did one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated kingdoms in Europe collapse into chaos, violence, and eventually dictatorship? The story of the French Revolution is not simple. It is a story of famine and feasts, of philosophers and peasants, of silk-clad nobles and barefoot soldiers, of soaring ideals and bloody executions. It is the story of a people who sought freedom, but who discovered that freedom often comes at a terrible price. Before we journey through the Bastille, the guillotine, and the rise of Napoleon, we must first set the stage. For revolutions do not appear out of thin air. They brew quietly, over years, sometimes decades, until the pressure of inequality, injustice, and broken promises finally erupts into flame. And so let us step back to 18th century France, a kingdom glittering with wealth and privilege, yet rotting from within, a kingdom about to face its reckoning. Part 1. The Seeds of Revolution. France. Before 1789, the Ancien Régime. To understand the revolution, we must first understand the world it destroyed. In the years leading up to 1789, France was ruled under what is known as the Ancien Régime, or the Old Order. At its heart stood the monarchy, a divine institution where the king was believed to rule by the grace of God. At this time, France was under the reign of Louis XVI, a man neither cruel nor particularly ambitious, but indecisive and ill-suited to the storms that would engulf him. Society was divided into three rigid estates. The first estate consisted of the clergy, guardians of the church and religion. Though they made up less than 1% of the population, they enjoyed vast privileges. They owned around 10% of the land in France, collected tithes from peasants, and paid little to no taxes. Many high-ranking clergy lived in luxury, though parish priests were often as poor as the people they served. The second estate was the nobility. Comprising just 2% of the population, they owned about a quarter of all French land. Nobles enjoyed privileges that went far beyond wealth. Exemption from most taxes, exclusive rights to hunt, and prominent positions in the army and government. At the glittering court of Versailles, nobles lived extravagantly, attending endless balls, feasts, and ceremonies, all while much of the country starved. The third estate was everyone else, around 97% of the population. It included peasants who toiled in the fields, urban workers struggling in crowded cities, and the bourgeoisie, or middle class, lawyers, merchants, artisans, and professionals. They carried the weight of the kingdom on their backs, paying nearly all the taxes while having almost no political voice. The resentment of this majority would be the powder keg that ignited the revolution. The social hierarchy was not merely unfair. It was suffocating. A man's birth determined his opportunities, his rights, and his place in society. No matter how wealthy or educated a member of the Third Estate became, he could never join the nobility. social mobility was almost impossible. This rigid inequality was tolerated for centuries, but as new ideas spread through Europe, the injustice became unbearable. The economic crisis. By the late 18th century, France was drowning in debt. Ironically, part of this debt was due to France's support for the American Revolution. Determined to weaken its old enemy Britain, France had poured money, weapons, and soldiers into the American colonies' fight for independence. While the Americans rejoiced in their freedom, France's treasury groaned under the weight of war costs. On top of this, the French monarchy itself was extravagantly wasteful. The Palace of Versailles, with its endless gardens, gilded halls, and lavish ceremonies, symbolized the grandeur of the monarchy, but also its financial recklessness. Court life was a spectacle of opulence, with nobles competing for the king's favor through rituals of etiquette and display. Queen Marie Antoinette, though often unfairly maligned, became a symbol of excess, nicknamed Madame Deficit, for her spending on clothes, jewels, and entertainments. Meanwhile, ordinary Frenchmen and women faced hunger. A series of poor harvests in the 1780s caused food shortages, driving the price of bread, the staple of the French diet, to unbearable heights. For peasants and workers who spent most of their income on food, this was catastrophic. While the rich feasted, the poor starved. Riots broke out as desperate people demanded bread. The burden of taxation deepened the misery. The nobility and clergy were largely exempt, leaving the Third Estate to shoulder the cost. Peasants paid feudal dues to their landlords, tithes to the church, and taxes to the crown, leaving them with barely enough to survive. The system was not only unjust, it was unsustainable. The influence of Enlightenment ideas. While economic hardship fanned the flames of discontent, the intellectual winds of the Enlightenment gave the fire its direction. For decades, philosophers had been questioning the foundations of monarchy, privilege, and inequality. Voltaire attacked the abuses of the church and championed freedom of speech. Rousseau argued for the sovereignty of the people, declaring that government must be based on the general will. Montesquieu advocated for separation of powers, a system where no single institution could dominate. These ideas spread through salons, pamphlets, and books, igniting discussions in coffeehouses and private gatherings. The bourgeoisie, educated and ambitious, were especially receptive. They read Rousseau's Social Contract and imagined a society where citizens had rights and voices in government. They admired the American Revolution and its declaration that all men are created equal. They began to ask, why not in France? The Enlightenment did not just inspire the middle class. Even peasants, though largely illiterate, absorbed its ideas indirectly. They heard of freedom and equality through conversations, rumors, and the speeches of local leaders. The language of rights and liberty began to seep into the consciousness of the masses. The American example. The success of the American Revolution struck a powerful chord in France. Here was proof that an old monarchy could be challenged, that a people could rise up and declare their independence, and that Enlightenment ideals could be turned into reality. French soldiers who fought in America returned home inspired by the spirit of liberty. The Marquis de Lafayette, who fought alongside George Washington, became a hero in both countries and would later play a role in the French Revolution. The American victory was not just military, it was symbolic. It told the French people that tyranny could be overthrown. It whispered the dangerous thought that perhaps kings were not invincible, and that perhaps the future belonged to citizens, not monarchs. A kingdom on the brink. By the late 1780s, the Kingdom of France stood on the edge of collapse. The monarchy was bankrupt, the people were hungry, and the Enlightenment had armed the nation with revolutionary ideas. Yet, The king and his advisers seemed blind to the storm gathering around them. Louis XVI was not a cruel man, but he was indecisive, easily swayed, and often. In 1789, facing financial ruin, Louis summoned the Estates General, a representative assembly of all three estates, for the first time in over 170 years. It was a desperate gamble, intended to secure new taxes to save the monarchy. Instead, it would unleash forces that could no longer be contained. The calling of the Estates General marked the beginning of the revolution. For the first time, the voices of the Third Estate would be heard, and once they spoke, they would not be silenced. Part 2. The Outbreak, 1989. The Estates General convenes. The year 1789 dawned with tension in the air. France was in crisis, financially, socially, and politically. The king's government was on the verge of bankruptcy. Bread riots erupted in towns and villages. Discontent echoed through every level of the Third Estate. To many it seemed that the kingdom was unravelling. In desperation, King Louis XVI announced that the Estates General would be summoned in May of 1789. This was extraordinary. The Estates General, a national assembly representing the three estates of the realm, had not been called since 1614, almost 2 centuries. Its revival was meant to solve the immediate financial crisis, but instead, it would awaken the sleeping giant of popular sovereignty. Delegates were chosen from all across France. Each estate elected its representatives. The clergy for the first estate, the nobility for the second, and everyone else for the third. Over 1,000 men would gather at Versailles. For the first and second estates, the gathering was an opportunity to preserve their privileges. For the third estate, it was a chance to challenge them. The process of electing deputies stirred debate at every level of society. Communities drafted cahiers de doléances, lists of grievances, that delegates would carry to Versailles. These notebooks revealed the depth of anger. Peasants complained of crushing taxes and feudal dues. Urban workers denounced food shortages and unfair laws. Even some nobles criticized corruption and inefficiency. A spirit of reform was in the air, but so too was the desire for profound change. When the Estates General finally opened in May, the atmosphere was charged with hope and suspicion. The king entered in ceremony, clad in royal robes, his presence meant to awe. Yet many deputies looked past the glitter and saw weakness. Louis XVI hoped to secure new taxes. The people hoped for justice, the struggle for power. From the beginning, conflict erupted over how voting would take place. Traditionally, each estate voted as a block. 1 vote for the clergy, 1 for the nobility, and 1 for the commoners. This system guaranteed that the privileged orders could outvote the Third Estate 2-1, no matter how many people it represented. But the Third Estate, making up 97% of the population, demanded change. They wanted voting by head, where each deputy had a vote. Under such a system, they would dominate with their numbers. This disagreement was not a mere technicality. It was a battle over legitimacy. Who truly represented France. Weeks passed in deadlock. Tensions mounted as the Third Estate grew impatient. They began to see themselves not as an inferior estate, but as the embodiment of the nation. Their anger crystallized in June when they made a bold, history-changing decision: the tennis court oath. On June 17, 1789, the deputies of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly. They no longer claimed to represent just the Third Estate, but the entire people of France. They would not be silenced or sidelined. 3 days later, locked out of their usual meeting hall, perhaps by accident, perhaps by design, they gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court. Here, in the sweltering heat, they made a solemn vow: the tennis court oath. With raised hands and determined hearts, they swore never to separate, until they had given France a constitution. This was revolutionary. Power no longer flowed from the king downwards. It was being claimed from the people upwards. The oath electrified France. It was a declaration that sovereignty lay not with a monarch by divine right, but with the citizens themselves. Some members of the clergy and even a few nobles soon joined the National Assembly. Momentum was building. Louis XVI, reluctant and indecisive, tried to assert control by ordering the estates to meet separately. But the tide had shifted. The king's authority was weakening, while the Assembly's resolve was hardening. The storming of the Bastille. Tensions soon boiled over into violence. In Paris, unrest grew daily. Food prices soared. Rumours spread that the king was massing troops to crush the Assembly. Citizens feared that their new hopes for liberty would be drowned in blood. On July 14, 1789, the anger erupted. A mob of Parisians marched to the Bastille, a medieval fortress that loomed over the city. To many, the Bastille symbolized tyranny. It was a prison where political dissenters had been locked away, a reminder of arbitrary royal power. Though only a handful of prisoners were held there, its symbolism was enormous. The crowd demanded weapons stored inside. Negotiations faltered, and the people stormed the gates. After hours of fierce fighting, the fortress fell. The governor was seized and killed, his head carried on a pike through the streets of Paris. The storming of the Bastille sent shockwaves through France and Europe. It was not just an attack on a prison, it was an attack on despotism itself. The people of Paris had shown they would not be intimidated. They had taken their destiny into their own hands. Louis XVI, informed of the fall, is said to have asked, "Is this a revolt?" To which the reply came, "No, sire. It is a revolution. The Great Fear." The spark in Paris ignited flames in the countryside. In the summer of 1789, a wave of panic swept through rural France in what became known as the Great Fear. Peasants, already restless from hunger and poverty, were gripped by rumours that nobles were plotting to send armed brigands to crush them. Villages rose in revolt. Manor houses were attacked. Feudal records, symbols of centuries of obligation, were burned in bonfires. Peasants demanded an end to the ancient dues and tithes that weighed them down. This rural uprising terrified the nobility and forced the National Assembly's hand. If the revolution was to be contained, concessions had to be made. The abolition of feudalism. On the night of August 4, 1789, the National Assembly gathered in an extraordinary session. One by one, nobles rose to renounce their feudal privileges. Hunting rights, tax exemptions, manorial dues, all were abandoned. By dawn, centuries of feudal order had been swept away. It was a dramatic moment, not only symbolic but transformative. The old structure of privilege, which had defined France for generations, was dismantled in a single night. Though implementation was uneven and peasants continued to struggle, the decision marked a turning point. For the first time, France moved decisively toward equality before the law. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. With feudalism abolished, the Assembly turned to defining the new principles of the nation. In late August, they adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This remarkable document, inspired by Enlightenment philosophy and the American Declaration of Independence, proclaimed universal rights, liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It declared that all men were born free and equal. Sovereignty, it announced, resided in the nation, not the king. Laws were to be the expression of the general will, though its promises would be unevenly fulfilled, excluding women, slaves, and the poor. It was a milestone in political thought. The Declaration became a beacon, shaping constitutions and movements across the globe. The Women's March on Versailles. Yet, for all the lofty declarations, hunger still stalked the land. In October 1789, bread shortages once again drove Parisians to desperation. This time, it was women who took the lead. On October 5th, thousands of women, market sellers, mothers, workers, marched from Paris to Versailles, a distance of more than 12 miles. They carried pikes, sticks, and whatever weapons they could find. Their demand was simple: bread. When they reached the palace, their fury was unstoppable. They forced their way inside, confronting the Queen, Marie Antoinette. Some shouted for her death, but more than anything, they demanded that the royal family return to Paris, where the people could keep watch. The next day, under the pressure of the crowd, Louis XVI and his family left Versailles for the capital. They would never return to the palace. The king was now a prisoner of the revolution, forced to live under the gaze of his subjects. The first year ends. By the close of 1789, France had been transformed. The absolute monarchy was crippled. Feudalism was abolished. A new declaration promised rights and liberty. The people had discovered their power in the streets. But the revolution was far from over. The forces unleashed were too vast, the divisions too deep. The struggle for the future of France had only just begun. Ahead lay years of war, terror, and upheaval, years that would shake the very foundations of Europe. Part 3. Building a New France, 1789 to 1791. The Revolution consolidates. The year 1789 had ended in triumph and uncertainty. The Bastille had fallen, the king was under the watchful eye of the people, and the National Assembly had declared sweeping reforms. Yet the revolution was still fragile. It was like a ship launched into stormy waters with no map and no clear captain. The French people were hopeful but anxious. They had torn down the old order, but what would replace it? Would they find stability and justice, or sink into chaos? The next 2 years would be an experiment unlike anything Europe had seen before. The attempt to build a constitutional monarchy and a new France on the ruins of the Ancien Régime. Reforming the nation, the National Assembly, now calling itself the Constituent Assembly, set to work with extraordinary ambition. Their goal was not just to patch the holes in the kingdom's finances, but to rebuild society on the foundation of liberty and equality. First came the matter of the Church. The Catholic Church had long been one of the pillars of the old order, owning vast lands and enjoying immense privileges. But the Assembly saw its wealth as a resource that could be used to rescue the nation. In November 1789, the Assembly nationalised church property. Lands that had been held by monasteries and bishops for centuries were confiscated and sold as biens nationaux, national goods. The sale of these lands provided revenue for the government and opened ownership to a broader segment of society, particularly the bourgeoisie. Next came the civil constitution of the clergy, passed in July 1790. This law transformed the Church in France. Priests and bishops were now to be elected by the people, rather than appointed by Rome. They were required to swear loyalty to the new government and constitution. To many revolutionaries, this seemed a reasonable step. But for the devout, it was a shocking break with tradition. The Pope condemned it, and many clergy refused the oath. The result was a bitter divide between juring priests who accepted the revolution and non-juring priests who did not. Religion, once a unifying force, now became a source of tension and even violence. Meanwhile, political and legal reforms swept through the land. The provinces of Old France, with their patchwork of laws and privileges, were replaced with 83 new departments, equal in size and governance. A uniform system of justice was introduced. Guilds and monopolies were abolished. opening trades to freer competition. For the first time, citizens began to feel the promise of equality before the law. A new constitution. At the heart of the Assembly's work was the drafting of a constitution. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals and the American example, it sought to balance monarchy with popular sovereignty. The Constitution of 1791 established France as a constitutional monarchy. The king would remain head of state, but his powers were limited. Laws would be made by a single-chamber legislature, elected by citizens who paid a certain level of taxes. While this system excluded the poorest from political participation, it was nonetheless a dramatic break from centuries of absolute rule. Louis XVI was given a suspensive veto. He could delay laws, but not block them entirely. This compromise was intended to preserve the monarchy while ensuring that sovereignty ultimately rested with the nation. The new political structure was complex, but its meaning was clear. The king was no longer absolute. He ruled only within the framework of the people's will. The king and queen, under watch. For Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, life had changed drastically. Once at the centre of the glittering world of Versailles, they were now confined to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. They lived under guard, their every move watched by the people. The king, indecisive by nature, struggled to adapt. At times he appeared willing to accept the new order, even donning the tricolour cockade, the revolutionary badge of red, white and blue. At other times he resisted, dragged by tradition, family pressure, and his own doubts. Marie Antoinette fared worse. To many revolutionaries, she became the embodiment of tyranny and extravagance. Pamphlets portrayed her as a foreign enemy, a spendthrift, even a seductress. Though much of this was exaggerated or false, the Queen's reputation never recovered. Her every word, gesture and expression was scrutinised with suspicion. The royal family's loss of freedom was not only humiliating, it was terrifying. They felt themselves prisoners in their own palace, at the mercy of an unpredictable crowd. Increasingly, they looked for escape. The flight to Varennes. In June 1791, desperation led to action. Secretly, the royal family planned their escape from Paris. Their goal was to reach the eastern frontier, where loyal troops waited to shelter them. From there, they hoped to rally support, perhaps even to crush the revolution. On the night of June 20th, disguised and hidden in a carriage, Louis, Marie Antoinette, and their children slipped out of the Tuileries. The journey was long and tense. At each stop, delays mounted. Their disguises were imperfect, their carriage conspicuous. Near the town of Varennes, the king was recognized. Local officials, alerted and suspicious, confronted the travellers. Soon the royal family was detained and escorted back to Paris. The flight to Varennes was a disaster for the monarchy. It destroyed any illusion that Louis was a willing participant in the revolution. The king, who had sworn to uphold the constitution, had instead tried to flee from it. To the people, it was proof of betrayal. Trust, once fragile, now collapsed. When the carriage returned to Paris, crowds lined the streets. Silent, grim, they stared at their king, not with loyalty but with anger. Louis was no longer seen as a father of the nation, but as a traitor. Growing divisions. By the summer of 1791, the revolution had split into factions. Moderates still hoped to preserve the constitutional monarchy, believing it offered stability. Radicals, however, argued that the king could not be trusted and that France should become a republic. The Champ de Mars massacre in July 1791 highlighted the growing tensions. Thousands gathered in Paris to sign a petition calling for the king's abdication. Alarmed, the city's National Guard fired on the crowd, killing dozens. The revolution, which had begun with unity, was now dividing into camps, each with its own vision of the future. Outside France, events also took a darker turn. Monarchs across Europe watched nervously. If France's king could be overthrown, what might happen in their own realms? Austria, ruled by Marie Antoinette's brother, denounced the revolution. Rumours of foreign interventions circulated. The revolution, once a domestic upheaval, was now becoming a European crisis. The end of the Constituent Assembly. By September 1791, the constitution was complete. The National Assembly declared its work finished and disbanded, making way for the new Legislative Assembly. Many of its members stepped aside, believing that their duty was done. France now had a constitution, a legislature, and a king whose powers were limited by law. On paper, it seemed a triumph. A new France had been built, freer, fairer, more equal, but beneath the surface danger brewed. The economy remained unstable. Bread shortages continued. The church was divided. The king was discredited. The revolution had not yet satisfied the people's hunger, neither for food nor for justice. The next stage would be more radical, more violent, and more unpredictable. France was about to plunge into the storm of war and terror. Part 2. The Revolution Unfolds. The storming of the Bastille in July 1789 was more than a violent outbreak. It was a symbol, a turning point, and a signal to the world that France had entered uncharted territory. The revolution had officially begun, and its energy would now spill into every corner of society. What followed was a cascade of radical change, debates, victories, and tragedies that redefined France and eventually much of Europe. The Great Fear and the collapse of feudalism. In the weeks after the fall of the Bastille, panic spread across the countryside. Known as the Great Fear, this period in July and August of 1789 saw rumours fly that nobles were plotting to send armed bands to destroy villages, burn crops, and starve the people into submission. These whispers, fueled by centuries of distrust, led peasants to take up arms. Villages organised militias, chateaux were attacked, and feudal records were destroyed in an effort to wipe away the obligations of serfdom. The National Assembly, watching the unrest spread, realised that something dramatic had to be done. On the night of August 4th, 1789, a historic session took place. In an extraordinary moment of collective fervour, nobles and clergy began renouncing their feudal privileges one after another. Hunting rights, manorial dues, tithes, and seigneurial courts, centuries-old structures, were abandoned. France, in one night, saw the symbolic death of feudalism. This was more than just a legal reform. It was a revolution in the minds of people. For peasants, it meant freedom from oppressive obligations. For nobles, it was a shocking loss of centuries of tradition and wealth. For the revolution as a whole, it was proof that the old order could be dismantled in a single stroke. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Soon after, in late August 1789, the Assembly produced one of the most famous documents of the era, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Inspired by Enlightenment ideas and the American Revolution, it proclaimed universal principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. All men are born and remain free and equal in rights, it declared. It guaranteed freedom of speech, religious tolerance, and protection of property. Sovereignty resided in the nation, not in the king. Though it left out women and slaves, the Declaration became a cornerstone of revolutionary ideals and continues to inspire human rights movements worldwide. It was not just a statement, it was a promise of a new kind of society, built not on birth or privilege, but on universal principles of justice. The king and queen under siege. While the revolution celebrated these triumphs, the monarchy remained at the centre of tension. King Louis XVI hesitated, resisted, and often seemed paralysed in the face of change. Queen Marie Antoinette, despised by many for her foreign origins and reputation for extravagance, became a target of revolutionary anger. In October 1789, when bread shortages once again reached a breaking point, thousands of Parisian women, many armed with pikes and whatever weapons they could find, marched to Versailles in what became known as the Women's March on Versailles. Their demand was simple but powerful: bread. The crowd stormed the palace, killed guards, and confronted the royal family. The outcome was decisive. The king and queen were forced to leave Versailles and return to Paris under the watch of the people. No longer secluded in the grandeur of their palace, they were now prisoners in all but name, their every move scrutinized by the revolutionaries. Reorganizing the nation. The revolution moved swiftly into restructuring French society. The church, one of the pillars of the old order, became a primary target. In 1789, church lands were confiscated by the state to address the nation's dire financial crisis. Soon after, the civil constitution of the clergy was passed in 1790, bringing the church under state control. Priests were required to swear loyalty to the revolution, creating a bitter divide between constitutional clergy, who accepted the changes, and refractory clergy, who resisted. This step alienated many devout Catholics and sowed seeds of counter-revolution, particularly in rural France where the church had deep roots. Yet for revolutionaries, it was a necessary blow against a powerful institution that had long aligned itself with monarchy and privilege. Meanwhile, the administrative and political map of France was redrawn. Old provinces with medieval privileges were replaced with rational uniform departments. Laws were standardized, weights and measures reformed, and the seeds of a modern nation-state were planted. The flight to Varennes. Despite the sweeping changes, the revolution was still fragile. Many feared that the king's cooperation was merely a facade. Those fears were confirmed in June 1791, when Louis XVI and his family attempted to escape Paris in disguise and flee toward loyalist strongholds in the east. This desperate bid for freedom failed at the small town of Varennes, where the royal family was recognized and arrested. The flight to Varennes was catastrophic for the monarchy. Any remaining trust between king and people evaporated. Louis was no longer a constitutional monarch, but a suspected traitor. The revolution's trajectory hardened. Moderates who still hoped for a balance between king and assembly lost ground, while radicals gained momentum. The rise of political clubs. Amidst this growing tension, political clubs became the heartbeat of revolutionary debate. The Jacobins, initially moderate but increasingly radical, pushed for a republic and greater equality. The Girondins, more cautious, favoured war to spread the revolution abroad, but were wary of radical social change. The Cordeliers Club, home to fiery voices like Georges Danton and journalist Jean-Paul Marat, demanded direct action and defended the rights of the poor. These clubs, meeting in converted monasteries and coffeehouses, created a new kind of political culture, one based on constant debate, pamphlets, and mass mobilization. Politics was no longer the domain of elites, but of citizens engaged in public life. War and revolution. By 1792, France stood on the brink of both internal collapse and external invasion. Many revolutionaries believed that war was inevitable and even desirable. They argued that war would unite the nation, expose traitors, and spread revolutionary ideals across Europe. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria. What followed was chaos. French armies, poorly organized and led by aristocratic officers who often defected, suffered humiliating defeats. Fear of counter-revolution grew, and suspicion of traitors reached fever pitch. In Paris, the atmosphere was electric. Radical newspapers fanned flames of anger, portraying the king as conspiring with foreign enemies. When Prussian forces threatened Paris, declaring they would punish the city if the royal family were harmed, the people exploded in fury. On August 10, 1792, thousands of Parisians stormed the Tuileries Palace. The king's Swiss guards were massacred, and Louis XVI was formally suspended from power. France was no longer a monarchy. It was, at least in spirit, a republic. The September massacres. The fall of the monarchy unleashed a wave of violence. In September 1792, as foreign armies advanced and prisons filled with suspected counter-revolutionaries, mobs broke into jails across Paris. For days, prisoners, nobles, priests, and even common criminals were slaughtered in a frenzy of fear and vengeance. These September massacres, though not organized by revolutionary leaders, horrified moderates and provided ammunition to enemies of the revolution. Yet to many radicals, they were a grim necessity, a purge of traitors at a moment when the revolution itself seemed under mortal threat. The Republic is born. Out of this chaos, a new government emerged. The monarchy was officially abolished, and France was declared a republic in September 1792. A new legislative body, the National Convention, was formed, tasked with guiding the revolution through its next and most radical phase. The revolution had travelled a long road in just 3 years. It began as a struggle for reform and balance, but had transformed into something far more radical, the creation of an entirely new order. Yet the greatest challenges and the darkest chapters still lay ahead. Part 3. Building a New France. By late 1792, the French Revolution had passed the point of no return. The monarchy was gone, the Republic had been proclaimed, and the old structures of feudal privilege were dismantled. Yet, in the shadow of triumph, France faced challenges as grave as any in its history. Foreign enemies massed at its borders, civil war smouldered within, and the nation itself was torn by competing visions of what this new France should be. It was a time of bold experimentation, unrelenting conflict, and profound transformation. The trial of the king. The most pressing question before the National Convention was what to do with the king. Louis XVI, once considered the father of his people, was now seen by many as a traitor who had conspired against the revolution. His failed flight to Varennes, his correspondence with foreign monarchs, and his indecision in moments of crisis had eroded any remaining faith in his leadership. The convention put Louis on trial in December 1792. For the first time in modern history, a reigning monarch was judged by his own people. The debates were fierce. Some argued that the king was guilty but should be spared for the sake of stability. Others insisted that sparing him would betray the revolution's principles. Ultimately, the convention voted. Louis was guilty of treason. In January 1793, he was sentenced to death. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was led to the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution in Paris. Dressed in white, calm and solemn, he attempted to address the crowd, but was drowned out by drums. The blade fell, and the king was no more. With his death, monarchy in France was not only abolished, it was executed. The execution shocked Europe. Monarchs everywhere trembled, fearing the spread of revolutionary fervour. In France, the act was both liberating and terrifying. The revolution had crossed a threshold. There was no turning back. Marie Antoinette's fate. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, followed a similar path. Imprisoned with her children, she became a symbol of royal arrogance to the revolutionaries and a figure of pity to her supporters. In October 1793, She was tried by the Revolutionary Tribunal, accused of conspiring with enemies of France and even slandered with grotesque charges. She was condemned to death. On October 16th, she was taken to the guillotine, dressed in a simple white gown, her hair shorn. Unlike her earlier life of glitter and excess, her end was stark and stripped of grandeur. The deaths of the king and queen symbolized the revolution's total break with the past. France was reborn, but the cost of this rebirth was steep. War on all fronts. Even as the revolution executed its monarch, France was surrounded by enemies. Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and other monarchies united to crush the revolutionary experiment before it spread. This was the beginning of the War of the First Coalition. At first, France's armies stumbled. Many officers were aristocrats who had fled abroad, leaving inexperienced commanders in charge. The early months of 1793 were filled with defeats and humiliations. Yet, the revolution responded not with surrender, but with radical measures. The convention declared a levée en masse, a mass conscription of all able-bodied men to defend the nation. For the first time, war became not just the business of kings and armies, but the duty of an entire people. The French nation was mobilized as never before, and this new citizen army would eventually transform European warfare. The Vendée Revolt. But war abroad was not the only struggle. At home, civil war erupted in the western region of the Vendée. Deeply Catholic and conservative, the people there resented the revolution's attack on the church and the execution of the king. They rose in rebellion, forming royalist armies that challenged revolutionary authority. The war in the Vendée was brutal. Villages were burned, atrocities committed on both sides, and tens of thousands were killed. For the revolutionaries in Paris, the Vendée was proof that counter-revolution was alive and dangerous. For the rebels, it was a desperate fight to defend their traditions and faith. The rise of the Jacobins. Inside Paris, politics grew more radical. The National Convention was divided between two main factions, the Girondins, who favoured a more moderate federalist approach, and the Montagnards, or Jacobins, who demanded stronger central control and radical social change. By mid-1973, the Jacobins, led by figures such as Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Jean-Paul Marat, gained the upper hand. Backed by the fiery Parisians sans-culottes, ordinary workers who demanded bread, equality, and justice. The Jacobins ousted the Girondins from power. The revolution had entered a new, more radical phase. The Jacobins promised to defend the Republic at all costs, even if it meant using terror as a tool of governance. The Reign of Terror. With foreign armies pressing on France's borders, rebellion raging in the provinces, and economic crisis deepening, the Jacobins established the Committee of Public Safety in 1793. This body, dominated by Robespierre, essentially became the executive government of France, wielding extraordinary powers. Under its rule, the revolution adopted the policy of terror. Suspected counter-revolutionaries, hoarders, and dissenters were arrested by the thousands. Revolutionary tribunals conducted trials that often led to swift executions. The guillotine became a daily spectacle in Paris, its blade falling on nobles, clergy, and even former revolutionaries who fell out of favour. Jean-Paul Marat, whose newspaper incited the people, was assassinated in his bath by Charlotte Corday, a young woman who believed she was saving France from his fanaticism. Georges Danton, once a leading revolutionary, was himself executed when accused of moderation. Robespierre, known as the Incorruptible, believed that terror was a necessary means to preserve virtue and defend liberty. Terror, he declared, is nothing but prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. The revolution, once celebrated for liberty, now seemed consumed by fear, the new revolutionary culture. Even as the guillotine dominated Paris, the Jacobins sought to reshape French society at its roots. They attempted to create a new civic religion, replacing traditional Catholicism with revolutionary festivals celebrating liberty, reason, and the Republic. The Festival of the Supreme Being, orchestrated by Robespierre in 1794, symbolized this effort to build a society founded not on superstition, but on virtue and reason. The calendar was also reformed. Months were renamed, weeks were made 10 days long, and Sundays were abolished. Time itself was remade in the image of revolution. These cultural changes, however, often confused and alienated ordinary people. While some embraced the vision of a rational secular France, others longed for familiar traditions. The revolution was not only a political upheaval, but also a profound cultural experiment, one that did not always succeed. Triumphs abroad. Despite internal turmoil, France's armies began to turn the tide of war. The levée en masse swelled the ranks of the military, and citizen soldiers, motivated by revolutionary zeal, began to achieve victories. By 1794, French forces pushed back their enemies and secured the Republic's survival. This success strengthened the Jacobins' belief that their radical measures were justified. The revolution was not only surviving, it was winning. But triumph abroad could not erase the growing unease at home. The fall of Robespierre. By mid-1794, the terror had reached its peak. Thousands had been executed, and fear gripped even the most loyal revolutionaries. Robespierre, increasingly isolated, seemed to see enemies everywhere. His insistence on virtue combined with ruthless purges alienated former allies. On July 27, 1794, 9 Thermidor, in the revolutionary calendar, Robespierre and his closest supporters were arrested. The next day they were executed by guillotine, the very instrument they had used to shape the revolution. The fall of Robespierre marked the end of the terror. It was a dramatic reversal. The man who had dominated France in the name of virtue was now condemned as a tyrant. After the terror, with Robespierre gone, France entered a new phase. The revolution continued, but its most radical edge had been blunted. The guillotine no longer ruled daily life, and political leaders sought a more moderate path. Yet the challenges remained immense. The war with Europe continued, the economy was fragile, and the revolution's ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, were still far from being realized in practice. But one thing was clear: France had changed forever. The monarchy was gone, the church humbled, the people mobilized, and the structures of the old regime dismantled. A new France was being built, though its final form was still uncertain. Part 4. The Revolution Radicalized and the Rise of Napoleon, 1794 to 1799. The Thermidorian Reaction. The execution of Robespierre in July 1794, known as the Thermidorian Reaction, marked a turning point in the French Revolution. The reign of terror was over, but France was far from stable. The revolution had unleashed forces that no one could easily control. Moderates returned to power in the National Convention, attempting to roll back some of the Jacobins' radical reforms. The calendar was adjusted, revolutionary festivals were scaled back, and many restrictions on religion were eased. Yet, even as the country sought a measure of normalcy, the deep economic, social, and political upheaval created lasting instability. The revolution had transformed the nation. Slavery was abolished in the colonies, though later reinstated under Napoleon. Noble privileges were gone, and the foundations of modern citizenship had been laid. Yet the price had been steep. Tens of thousands dead, internal divisions unresolved, and France embroiled in constant war. The Directory and a fragile republic. In 1795, a new constitution was adopted, creating the Directory, a 5-member executive body intended to provide stability. The new government also established a bicameral legislature, the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients. The Directory was designed to prevent the return of both monarchy and radical dictatorship, but it was weak and inefficient. Corruption was rampant, finances were unstable, and political factions remained fierce. Royalists sought to restore the monarchy, while Jacobins and radical groups sought renewed revolutionary zeal. Meanwhile, the economy struggled under high inflation and food shortages. The public, exhausted by years of upheaval, grew disillusioned. Street riots, coups, and conspiracies became common, and the Directory relied heavily on the army to maintain order. France at war. Externally, France remained at war with European powers. The Revolutionary Wars, begun in 1792, had evolved into a series of coalitions against France. Austria, Prussia, Britain, and other nations sought to crush the revolution and restore the monarchy. Yet France's armies, strengthened by conscription and inspired by revolutionary fervour, proved formidable. By the mid-1970s, French forces were achieving decisive victories across Europe, expanding French influence and spreading revolutionary ideals. These campaigns, however, placed heavy demands on society and created opportunities for military leaders to rise in prominence. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. Out of this chaotic environment emerged Napoleon Bonaparte, a young and ambitious general from Corsica. Napoleon had already demonstrated extraordinary skill in Italy, where he led French forces to stunning victories against Austria. Napoleon's genius lay not only in strategy, but in understanding the politics of the revolution. He aligned himself with the Directory when it suited him, projected himself as a defender of the Republic, and capitalized on the population's desire for stability and national glory. By 1799, France was ripe for a new leader. The Directory was weak, discredited, and unable to solve the nation's problems. Napoleon, with his military success, popularity, and political acumen, positioned himself as the answer to France's instability. The coup of 18 Brumaire. On November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, Napoleon carried out a coup d'état. With the support of key political allies and the army, he dissolved the Directory and established the consulate, a new government in which he held the most power as first consul. The coup was relatively bloodless, and Napoleon presented himself as a restorer of order rather than a revolutionary. Many citizens, weary from years of turmoil, welcomed his leadership. France, exhausted by revolution and war, now had a single decisive leader who promised stability, reform, and national glory, consolidating power. Once in power, Napoleon moved quickly to consolidate control. He centralized administration, reformed the tax system, and strengthened the legal code. The Napoleonic Code, introduced in 1804, codified laws based on equality before the law, property rights, and secular authority. It replaced the inconsistent and fragmented legal systems of the old regime. Napoleon also reconciled with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801, which restored some church influence but kept it under state control. This pragmatic approach stabilized society and reduced tensions between revolutionaries and religious citizens. Education and infrastructure were improved, with the state taking a central role in shaping the nation. Napoleon understood that a strong France required not only military might, but also administrative efficiency, legal clarity, and public loyalty. The legacy of the revolution in Napoleon's era. Though Napoleon would become emperor and rule with near absolute authority, the revolution's legacy endured. the abolition of feudal privileges, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the principles of secular law reshaped France forever. Napoleon preserved many of these gains while creating a state capable of defending them and projecting power across Europe. Napoleon also exemplified a paradox. He embodied the revolutionary principle of meritocracy, rising from modest nobility to dominate Europe. Yet he consolidated power in a manner reminiscent of monarchy. In many ways, he was both a child of the revolution and its greatest compromise. Conclusion. By the end of the 1790s, France had transformed beyond recognition. The revolution had toppled a centuries-old monarchy, abolished feudal privileges, and instilled ideas of equality, citizenship, and national sovereignty. Yet it had also unleashed violence, division, and uncertainty. Napoleon's rise marked the beginning of a new era, one in which France would dominate Europe militarily and politically, while grappling with the ideals and consequences of the revolution. The nation had been reborn, but the struggle to balance liberty, equality, and order, a struggle begun in 1789, would continue for decades to come. The French Revolution was more than an event. It was a revolution of the mind, society, and nation. It changed how humans thought about power, rights, and governance. It inspired countless movements across the world, and its echoes can still be felt in our political and social consciousness today. Part 5. The Revolution's Enduring Legacy, 1799 to 1815 and beyond. Napoleon's Empire and the Revolution's Principles. With Napoleon Bonaparte firmly in power as first consul and later Emperor of the French, the ideals of the Revolution took on a new form. While absolute monarchy had been overthrown, Napoleon concentrated power in his own hands. Yet, paradoxically, he preserved many of the revolution's gains. The Napoleonic Code became one of his most enduring contributions. It codified laws to ensure equality before the law, protection of property, secular authority, and merit-based advancement. Feudal privileges were permanently abolished. These reforms cemented the revolution's legal legacy and influenced European law for generations to come. Napoleon also modernized the state. Administrative centralization, improved taxation systems, and national education reforms strengthened France internally. While his rule was authoritarian, it was grounded in the structures created by the revolution. Expansion and war across Europe. Napoleon's military campaigns spread revolutionary ideas far beyond France. His armies carried with them the principles of citizenship, equality, and secular governance. Conquered territories, from Italy to the Low Countries, Germany to Spain, saw the abolition of feudal privileges, secularization of state institutions, and introduction of legal codes inspired by the French model. Yet, this expansion came with enormous human cost. Wars raged across Europe for over a decade, leaving millions dead or displaced. Resistance to French occupation emerged everywhere, especially in Spain and Prussia, highlighting that revolutionary ideals were not universally embraced. Napoleon's empire demonstrated a central truth of the revolution. Ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity could inspire both admiration and resistance. The revolution's principles had universal appeal, but also provoked fear and conflict. The limits of the revolution. Despite its achievements, the revolution could not solve all of France's problems. Political instability continued after Napoleon's defeat. Social inequality, though reduced, persisted. Women, despite active participation in revolutionary movements, were largely excluded from political rights. Slavery, initially abolished in colonies, was reinstated under Napoleon and remained a painful contradiction of revolutionary ideals. The revolution also showed the dangers of radicalism. The Reign of Terror and political purges revealed how idealism could turn to brutality. Robespierre's execution and the subsequent Thermidorian reaction demonstrated the fragile balance between liberty and order. France had learned that revolution could achieve great change, but it could also spiral into chaos. The Congress of Vienna and the Restoration. After Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815, Europe sought to restore stability. The Congress of Vienna aimed to reinstate monarchies, redraw borders, and prevent future revolutionary upheaval. While the old aristocratic order was partially restored, the ideas of the French Revolution could not be erased. Across Europe, constitutional monarchies, legal reforms, and civic movements reflected the enduring influence of 1789. The revolution had planted seeds that would continue to grow long after the guillotine fell silent. The revolution as a global inspiration. The French Revolution inspired movements worldwide. In the Americas, it reinforced ideas of independence and republican government. In Europe, it inspired liberal and nationalist movements that would continue into the 19th century. Colonies, oppressed peoples, and marginalized groups looked to France as a model of popular sovereignty and human rights. The revolution's ideas transcended borders. Liberty, equality, and fraternity became rallying cries for those challenging monarchy, colonialism, and inequality. Its influence can be traced to political reforms, constitutions, and revolutionary movements across centuries and continents, the Revolution and modern France. Within France, the Revolution permanently reshaped society. Feudalism was abolished, citizenship became a legal and political concept, and secular governance became the norm. The Revolution introduced the concept of national identity. France was no longer a kingdom ruled by divine right, but a nation of citizens with rights and responsibilities. Even under Napoleon, the Republic's foundations endured. The administrative, legal, and educational reforms remained, creating a strong, centralized state capable of governing a modern nation. Revolutionary ideals, though tempered by authoritarianism, guided France's development long after 1799, the legacy of liberty and human rights. Perhaps the revolution's most enduring contribution was the idea that human beings possess inherent rights. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen continues to inspire movements for civil liberties worldwide. It provided a framework for understanding justice, equality, and the role of government in protecting citizens. The revolution also demonstrated the power and danger of popular movements. Ordinary people could influence politics, overthrow entrenched institutions, and demand accountability from rulers. The revolution was a profound lesson in both empowerment and responsibility. Lessons from the French Revolution. Looking back, the French Revolution offers enduring lessons. 1. The demand for justice and equality can drive profound societal change. The revolution showed that ordinary citizens, when mobilized, could challenge entrenched power structures. 2. Radical change carries risks. The Reign of Terror and civil conflicts revealed that revolution could produce both liberation and violence. 3. Institutions matter. France's legal, administrative, and military reforms ensured that some revolutionary gains survived even when regimes changed. 4. Ideas can outlive regimes. Though Napoleon eventually fell, the revolution's principles shaped political thought worldwide. The revolution in memory and history. The French Revolution is remembered as one of the most transformative events in human history. Its heroes, figures like Robespierre, Danton, and Marat, and its victims, including Louis XVI and countless citizens, are part of a complex tapestry. The revolution was not a single event, but a process. The struggle to balance liberty, equality, and order, the challenge of governing amidst social upheaval, and the quest to redefine what it meant to be a citizen. For historians, the Revolution remains a source of endless study, debate, and inspiration. It reshaped France, influenced Europe, and offered a vision, both inspiring and cautionary, of what society might achieve when its people rise in pursuit of justice. Conclusion. By the end of the 18th century and into the early 19th, France had been irrevocably changed. The Revolution toppled kings, abolished feudalism, redefined citizenship, and spread ideas of equality and rights across the globe. Its consequences were felt in wars, reforms, revolutions, and political thought worldwide. Napoleon's rise, military conquests, and legal reforms were a continuation of the revolution in a new form, centralized, pragmatic, and powerful. Yet, the core ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, remained alive, inspiring generations to come. The French Revolution was not merely a chapter in history, it was a turning point for humanity. It challenged the very notion of authority, questioned entrenched hierarchies, and proclaimed that people could govern themselves. Its lessons, both triumphant and tragic, continue to resonate, reminding us that freedom is never given, but earned and defended through courage, vision, and action.